Hello, lovely podcast people. So, I don't really pay a great deal of attention to the camera that's in front of me because I know previously from the stats that very few people really watch my podcast. And I guess in a way it's my also personal bias of like, God, who has the time to watch some boring guy? It's not like I'm super flamboyant and animated. But anyway, Lucy mentioned to me that the YouTube version of my podcast is actually doing quite well at times. So that was worrying because I really don't look. I just look around the room and look down and just like look off into the distance. I guess as well, as long as you're fine with it. Then the other day, someone tagged me. They've got some fancy what's it called? Stairmaster, whatever you call it. Stairmaster. And it's kind of had built-in YouTube. So she's there on the stepper watching me on YouTube. So anyway, I should probably make a bit more of an effort. I don't know how I can. You're not watching it for my looks, I doubt, unless you're into some niche stuff. Anyway, this podcast is off the back of my Q&A box on Instagram, and someone asked, why is everyone obsessed with, what have I written down here? Coco Pops after training. Are they magic? And it's one of those things. I remember my friend Jamie Alderton back in the day, he did a thing where I think it was Skittles he had, and he just, I can't remember where this was it Instagram? And he would just, all of his videos would be, when he did loads of training videos, or stuff about his nutrition when he was competing, I guess, in whatever it's called, bodybuilding stuff. And he just said, and he would do, I think he said this to me once, we were just in the car driving, he was like, yeah, sometimes I just like do only the red Skittles. And people just copy that stuff. It's, it's the power of the internet, the power of influence and whatnot, the power of having a good physique. And anyway, so I wanted to discuss quickly this concept of, I guess, carbohydrates after training. And, when I posted a quick question, a quick answer to this question, I ended up getting lots of follow-ups. So I thought, it's a worthwhile short podcast, carbohydrates after training. And as usual, do you know what? I'm going to stay away predominantly from any performance-based stuff, I think. So when I say performance, I'm really talking endurance performance, top high-level marathon runners, cyclists, etc. The rest of us who are slightly less crazy, we don't need to worry about that stuff. Because there is some stuff about carbohydrates after training, essentially these things called recover low or sleep low, which essentially in those modes of exercise, they are potentially depleting local stores of muscle glycogen, let's say in the quads for a cyclist, and by not replenishing those carbohydrate stores, muscle glycogen stores in the quads, it does stuff. It upregulates signaling in the body. And I said I wasn't going to go into this, but basically you can kind of force your body to work harder, putting stress on the mitochondrial machinery. Anyway, I'm not going to digress anymore. Stay on topic. I'm going to talk really about, I guess, more general population situations. And typically we're talking about the body composition situation here. So people who want this holy grail of fat loss and muscle gain, or just muscle gain with minimal fat gain, and wanting to maximize either recovery from exercise. So even like I've done a CrossFit workout and I want to be recovered for my next session, versus I want to gain some muscle, or I want to repair my muscles from a big gym session because I'm trying to build big pecs or biceps or booty. Oh, what's another B word? Biceps, booty, or back. I mean, who cares about your back? I'm saying that for one of my friends who I'm like, yeah, knows I never train back properly because I'm like, you can't see it in the mirror. And he's like, the fact you can't see your back in the mirror is the issue. Anyway, bodybuilding joke, boring. So to cut a long story short, there's two elements to this. One, does consuming carbohydrate after exercise improve our recovery? There's two particular types of recovery I'm going to talk about here. One is the ability of the muscle to exert force at the same level. So after training, we essentially get this or potentially get this muscle damage. The ability of the muscle to exert force is reduced. We recover, we come back to the next session. And also the repairing and building. If we trained in a particular way that's going to lead to increased muscle and signals for the muscle to build, are we providing adequate nutrition for that? So the place that most people should start with this is protein and consuming adequate protein. This podcast is not about that. I may do a separate one, but I have a very, very good Instagram post on this, on exactly how much protein you should consume and when you should consume it and the type of protein to maximize your muscle gain. So you can go on my Instagram for that. That was on like a rolling advert for people for a while. So lots of people will have seen it. It got seen by several hundreds of thousands of people. Pity it didn't have some sort of fancy product you could buy. I just did it to do some tests. Anyway, so we know there's this old school idea that we consume protein and then you need to consume high glycemic index carbohydrates to spike your insulin, and then you spike your insulin and it drives the amino acids into the muscle and you get super jacked, man. And we now know, or we have known for a long time, that this probably isn't necessary. There's a couple of papers. I've forgotten when the first one was. I feel like the first one is like... It was early days, I guess, in my career, and I can't remember that one. Maybe I'll find you the paper. So I feel like it was maybe not that early, 2007. That's only, where are we now? 15 years ago. So yeah, in the first several years of my career. I think it's 2007 paper. Anyway, it's one of the first ones where they sort of looked at if you consume protein after training versus consume protein and carbohydrate, is there a difference? And they showed there was no real difference, right? And if I'm remembering correctly, I think I kind of was like, meh, ignore. It's one study. And but then there's some interesting papers that came out of Nottingham University, which is obviously just down the road from me. And they were looking at all sorts of carbohydrate stuff. It was very interesting. I believe they were some of the first people to look at like multiple transportable carbohydrates, if I remember. Greenhalgh's lab, using like glucose and fructose and seeing what could happen in terms of your gut taking up these different carbohydrates and how quickly you could do that, and if that impacted glycogen storage and stuff. And they also looked at like you consume carbohydrate and that obviously raises insulin, but it's worth bearing in mind that when you consume protein, the amino acids and particularly leucine is an independent stimulator of muscle protein synthesis, and these amino acids raise insulin as well. So whey protein is this kind of perfect food for people wanting to, repair muscle, build muscle. But do we get any benefit from adding extra carbohydrate? So I think Greenhalgh's lab, they looked at essentially the amount of insulin you needed floating around for amino acids to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and how much, and the other side of the equation is muscle protein breakdown. So we kind of, in the post-training period, we want to reduce muscle protein breakdown and increase muscle protein synthesis. So yeah, and it's something like 5 molar units for being able for amino acids, which is like pretty much baseline. So you don't need any particular amount of insulin for protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So we're done there. And then muscle protein breakdown, I can't actually remember, but I feel like it was about 30 molar units, which is essentially like you get more than enough. Just as long as you're consuming enough protein post-training, you're going to be probably, and the protein is of a good sort of quality source, like your dairies, whey proteins type stuff. It's going to get you past this level. And then there was another study in is there another thing I was going to say there? No, maybe not. There was another study in 2015, which mimicked that one that I think was done. Oh, that's weird. I've never yawned in a podcast. Don't know where that came from. My apologies. Who yawned? Did you yawn when I yawned? Did you catch it? In 2015, there was this study by Staples. And you know what? Now I've said that out loud, I feel like they might have been from Greenhalgh's lab. Anyway, doesn't matter. You don't care. I'm just kind of reminiscing a bit here. And they showed this same thing. I think they just used a standardized, it was like 25 grams of protein, which is a little bit annoying because you're not standardizing between subjects and body weights, but whatever, 25 is enough for kind of maximally stimulating for someone of about 75 kilos or more, under 75 kilos, which, average subjects, whatever. It's a bit more than 70 kilos, isn't it? It's about 70, third, 83. Is that right? 0.3, 8, 16, 24. Yeah, about that, 24.9. Cool. So about 83 kilos. Anyway, sorry, mental arithmetic's not great, is it, when you're live on a podcast? So it's going to be enough for the types of subjects they're getting in these studies. And they then ingested that with, I think, about 50 grams of just glucose or just a simple carbohydrate, and just showed that the addition of carbohydrate did not augment, increase this response, this anabolic response to protein feeding. And after that, I was like, yeah, do you know what? We've got this mechanistic data from Greenhalgh, from early 2000s. You've got this other study that I don't know why I can't remember an author or anything on that. Maybe it never happened. I'm sure it did. And then you got this new study, and it all slots together. And now in 2022, nothing's come along to suggest any otherwise. So, do we need carbohydrate in that post-exercise period for that kind of repair and muscle building? Probably not. Almost certainly not. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have it. And then there's two more discussions. One, could there be a benefit for other reasons of having it then? And then the energy recovery. So if you're just doing a gym workout, you're not really depleting muscle glycogen levels. Like, you have to do a lot of exercise using one very specific muscle group to deplete the muscle glycogen in that muscle. And it's also, the depletion is fiber specific. So if you've been doing, lower intensity endurance based, it's depleting more of your, I believe this is true. I'm just suddenly questioning myself of like, is that the case? And I think it is. Maybe I should look it up. It doesn't matter for this discussion, but you're not depleting. And, on top of that, we know that someone can do several weeks of a ketogenic diet, very, very low carbohydrate diet, and it doesn't impact resistance training, volume and adaptations, etc. So this idea, and as well, based on how people tend to train, or at least let's say you're going for muscle building, you're not going to go in and train chest on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday or whatever. You might train a body part 2 or 3 times a week, but rarely on consecutive days. It doesn't really make a great deal of sense. So, and what we know is that you don't need to consume all the carbohydrate in that post-training period. So you can just consume your carbohydrate over the day, and as long as you've got kind of 24 hours or more, you're going to be, and then we can go into performance situations where, Tour de France, or you're playing, I don't know, sevens rugby. Do you play multiple games in a day, or like rugby tournaments at least, or like 5-a-side football tournaments? Or I'm pretty sure when Sarah plays netball, they play like lots of games in a day at one of these, before they go and get wasted in Spain on one of these girls netball tour, girls on tour, netballers on tour. I think they drink a lot, but I think they play a lot of netball as well. Sober, or not, I don't know. Anyway, point being, those situations, maybe there's some argument for some higher glycemic index carbohydrates, large amounts immediately after training. But if you're not training multiple times a day and a body part multiple times a day, it just doesn't seem to be necessary. So for our muscle building, our muscle repair, and our usual training, even if you're doing like CrossFit where you're using lots of different muscles and bones, you're breaking a few bones to do some pull-ups and using some muscles here and there. I'm just hating on CrossFit. I've got no hate for CrossFit. I'm just joking, making a very low level common human joke. nothing clever about it. I apologize. You're not depleting muscle glycogen. So as long as you're eating adequate calories, like again, it's like, oh well, if you're dieting and not getting enough calories, it's like, yeah, well then in that instance, are you going to be able to consume a boatload of Cocoa Pops or whatever? My choice is squashies or pick and mix after training. Maybe not so, because you're dieting. And it might be in those instances that, when, let's say you are dieting and you're training, really for a physique competition or bodybuilding competition, there would be some arguments for, okay, putting more of those carbohydrates, in the peri-workout period, 3 hours before the workout, so they can be stored and used for the training session, and maybe some post-training so that they go to the muscle that's just been worked and stored. Because we know that, and this is kind of the final little bit of the discussion where if we talk about health and body composition, if we're talking about there's this idea that maybe somehow the carbohydrates, it's a funny one, isn't it? The carbohydrates you consume in this post-training period are somehow less fattening, which is just a difficult sell, because there's something called this P ratio, and the sort of partitioning of calories towards storage versus use for whatever. It could even just be storage within muscle, or storage to fat, or oxidation, or useful processes. But carbohydrate, as I've talked about on my podcast before, it's very, very difficult ever to store carbohydrate as fat anyway. So you've really only got two fates for it, and that's either storage as muscle glycogen or oxidation, burning for energy. And one amazing thing about exercise, so again, in individuals who are insulin resistant, let's say you have insulin resistance caused by a very high level of body fat, obesity, and exercise can basically undermine that insulin resistance and allow you to store the glucose that you consume inside your muscle, which is a relatively positive thing to occur. Just a little super duper side note. What's interesting is lots of people say, oh, you're overweight, you shouldn't be eating many carbs, right? If you eat carbs, you're going to store them as fat. And, it's like, if you're insulin resistant, you're at an increased chance of storing these starchy carbs as fat. When you are insulin resistant, you struggle. Obese individuals have lower levels of what's called de novo lipogenesis, the creation of new fat from carbohydrate, for instance. It's lower than in a lean individual who's insulin sensitive. So this idea of these, of what I guess these zealots or whoever, they don't understand biochemistry. Most of them have never read a textbook, right? They stopped eating Krispy Kreme donuts and Twinkies, et al. And we're like, oh my goodness, low carb is the way. Tim Noakes. I've never been able to lose weight, and look what it's done. It's like, yeah, guess what, you gimp? Krispy Kreme donuts aren't just carbs. They're fats as well. Whatever. So, where was I? I went off on one, didn't I? But exercise undermines or, improves, undermines the negative effects that our body is experiencing because of what's called non-insulin dependent glucose transport. So basically you get these transporters from inside the muscle, and they basically translocate to the edge of the cell. And just think of them like a drawbridge that just goes down over the edge of the cell. So when glucose is floating around your body, it's like, cool, we can go over the drawbridge, rather than normally insulin would have to get this to happen. But exercise does it automatically. So you don't need insulin to have its effect, because, let's say insulin isn't, you're insensitive to it. Insulin's lost its voice. So it's not loud. It hasn't got a loud enough voice to shout, lower the drawbridge. I tell you what, I should be on like GCSE Bite Size. I should be on the Joe Wicks version of YouTube streaming of teaching people biology, I think. Who agrees? Give me an MBE, because at least I won't lie to people and make up. It's very funny, actually. Someone said to me, I called out Joe Wicks on my most recent post. It's just funny. It's just fun. It's banter. Calorie counting's old school science. Do you remember when he said that? I put that on. He basically called calorie counting old school science, obviously to sell his stuff. And then someone said, I used to work with Joe, and I was in the sort of like one of the departments. He said, it's crazy that he would go calorie counting is old school science, because guess what we use to create people's plans? Calories. Anyway, thanks to that guy. I mean, I knew that, obviously, but it's just bonkers, isn't it? That the extent people go to mislead people to make money. So, lower the drawbridge, not working, but exercise is kind of like the man on the inside. He kicks down the drawbridge so people can get in for a bit. And what's interesting about exercise is insulin sensitivity can stay elevated for up to 48 hours. And there's other adaptations, like in the gut, in the splanchnic regions of your gut. There are changes that occur through exercise that go, basically, we can get more glucose into the systemic, but basically into your circulation, right? Floating around your blood towards your muscles. And this is why we can get this increased, and again, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about performance, but for athletes, that post-training period, it's like we can get more muscle glycogen storage occurring. It's just tricky to really make the bold claim that somehow the carbohydrates in that period would be less fattening. Now, you might get slightly different 24-hour glucose curves, so the glucose in your system. That's a much more complicated discussion that I don't think really is warranted for my podcast, my listeners, the types of stuff you guys want. You can go and read up on this if you want, in terms of. The problem is after exercise, you have all these hormones floating around and they do things, right? So during exercise, you don't want your body to be really good at storing and keeping glucose low. You want your body going, actually, we want to give glucose to the blood system because we don't want our brain to die, and we want to have adequate fuel for really important reasons, maintaining our blood glucose at a time when blood glucose has probably been burnt at a lot higher rate. And so actually post-training, you've got this elevated presentation of glucose to the system endogenously, so from inside your body. So stuff like liver glycogen being broken down to make sure we're keeping our blood glucose at healthy levels so we don't go hypoglycemic. So if we then ingest glucose, you actually, I don't remember the time courses, whether it's like 1, 2, 3, 5 hour post-exercise, but you actually get this like slightly higher area under the curve for glucose. So then if you're like, oh, like exercise is brilliant, carbohydrates definitely aren't bad for you, you will get increased muscle glycogen synthesis from carbs that you eat in that period. Do you need that? Probably not, unless you're an ultra high level athlete. So, this whole the Joe Wicks discussion is an interesting one, right? Because I've had so many people and seen so many people, and a huge criticism of him is he basically led to this, I guess, little mini era of people believing they could only eat carbohydrate if they had exercised that day, like earning that carbohydrate, which is a very toxic message to be sending to people, because obviously you need energy to live, Joseph. Well, I wonder what he's up to these days. Maybe he's gone, do you know what? I want to get qualified. I want to learn about nutrition. Maybe he's going to do some CPD. Who knows? Listening to my podcast while sat on the beach drinking a pina colada. Where are we? I think I've kind of said anything that I wanted to say. Anything above that, really, we just go into performance. Why people eating? So the reason I think people are probably eating Cocoa Pops then is because they're probably of the ilk that they're a clean eater. This is a guess, obviously, but if they're going to eat a less optimal food stuff, So obviously it's like, I don't like this idea of good and bad foods, but we are hopefully all fully aware that eating lots of processed food is not a good thing for our health. It's the root of many of our sort of Western diseases. We shouldn't be hugely emphasizing processed foods at all. But, good and bad foods are not a great way of looking at things. Higher and lower nutrient density. So, Cocoa Pops aren't particularly nutritious, but they provide us with carbohydrates, and they taste lovely to some people. So, these other people eating only these super nutritious, high nutrient density foods other times of the day, but they really want some Cocoa Pops, so they eat them then. Great, happy days. But they probably would fare no different to having those Cocoa Pops at another time of the day, as long as, set par is, I think that's Latin for Alexa. What does set par mean in Latin? I think it means all else meaning.
I don't know.
No, she doesn't know. Anyway, I feel like I learned that in economics, actually. Never mind. It's going to bug me now. I'll go look it up later. You guys are going, yeah, it does, or I've not got a clue. Carry on with the podcast. So all else being equal, they probably, almost certainly, it would be exactly the same outcome. So you don't need to worry about it. You don't need to do it. It probably doesn't provide any benefit. And anything else that would have a discussion about carbohydrates post-training would probably lead us down the road of performance. So I hope that's been helpful. I'll just actually say one more thing. Sorry. In the kind of, I guess, intermittent fasting literature, in the circadian rhythm, chrononutrition literature, your body clock, times of day when your muscle is really insulin sensitive versus when you wake up, your muscle is insulin sensitive, and actually your adipose tissue, fat tissue, is a little bit more insulin resistant. And then over the day, that seems, at least on average in most people, this might not be the same for everyone, to change to where in the evening your muscle is less insulin sensitive and your fat is more insulin sensitive. But then if you obviously exercise towards the end of the day, you are going to ramp up muscle insulin sensitivity. And in some of the papers, I think, was it last week's podcast, I talked about that SOFA paper. I got Toby, I think, to time point it, and he was like, oh, you're very close on some of the studies, or a year off here or there, or you got this one bang on. They obviously did large proportion of carbohydrates consumed in the evening meal, but they were, I believe, in that study doing exercise towards the evening. So, having your carbohydrates in that end period, and obviously that group had increased fat loss. Now, there's confounding variables in all of this. It's super important for us to just pay attention to the low-hanging fruit and the major variables that we know that will impact this, which is our energy balance. But yeah, and these things are only going to make an impact over the long term. So what's going through my head right now, which is a slightly more advanced discussion, is just this idea of, well, if you're releasing less insulin, so you train and then you have, huge boluses of carbohydrate, whether it's just your largest carbohydrate meal of the day or whatever, through not needing to release as much insulin because you are going to dispose, like I said, the drawbridge, the muscles, the glucose is going to jump into your muscle and chill out and be in a happy place, and you haven't got insulin in the system, what then will happen is you've got this respiratory exchange ratio, which is basically the ratio of carbohydrate to fat that you're burning. And this number ranges from 0.7 to 1. And towards the 1 figure, you're burning more fat, and 0.7, so 1 is pure fat you're burning for energy. 0.7 is fat for energy, carbohydrate for energy. And what will happen is, when we talk about metabolic flexibility, so someone's ability to switch between which fuel they need to burn for energy appropriately based on what they are doing, etc. Some people struggle, they are inflexible and they struggle, it can go either way, struggle to burn carbohydrate if you've been keto for a long time. Likewise, you struggle to burn fat if you're metabolically inflexible, and potentially, insulin resistance plays a role in that. And so in this scenario, if we dumping all of our carbohydrate into the muscle, and then we're not releasing lots of insulin, therefore we can get back to a kind of low insulin state quicker and be burning fat for energy. But just bearing in mind that overall energy balance and fat balance is what's going to lead to the longitudinal effects of, if you're going for weight loss, you'd be in a deficit long term. So it's difficult to really make strong reasons why these carbohydrates in the post exercise period are advantageous. But there's at least interesting, mental masturbation that can be done there. But for clients and people you want to simplify things for, it just doesn't matter. And, whenever's going to suit them well and get them to adhere long term, that's the most important thing. Cool. I've enjoyed this podcast a lot more than I thought I would. I thought it was going to be like 10 minutes. I think it's been a bit longer. Lots of references that I will obviously get stuck on the website. And if you want to know like all of this stuff, especially if you're a practitioner, if you're a nutritionist, dietitian, personal trainer, whoever, and wants to be an absolute boss on nutrition and learn all of this stuff, do Mac Nutrition Uni. I don't know when this will be released, probably Tuesday, so like middle of May. Enrollment's open in July, on July 13th. That's like May, June, July. 2 months, 8 weeks. Sheesh, probably should start telling people, aka this podcast. But yeah, you'll learn all this. You'll be able to program for clients. It's the best course in the world. This isn't just something big. This is just an advert, a little advert. If you haven't got your prerequisites, we have got this prerequisite course now. I think it's about 18 hours study, roughly. I think we're actually releasing that on the 30th of May. So yes, you just email us, MNU for Mac Nutrition Uni, at mac-nutrition.com and say, I would like to study MNU in September this year, but I don't have a prerequisite. Can I do your specific prerequisite course? And we'll say, yes, you can. You need to get it done before September. It's about 18 hours study. Can you do that? And you'll be like, yeah, of course I can. I'm not a gimp. And we'll go, amazing. And also, by the way, we'll give you some of the money off the fees for the short course when you sign up for MNU. So it's a no-brainer. Get it done. You're welcome. Oh, you guys are so amazing. Thanks so much. Our boss teaches us to have great customer service. He's amazing. We love him. It's Friday, 5 p.m. I hope you have a brilliant weekend. Obviously, you're listening to this on a Tuesday, so I hope you have a brilliant week, and then your next weekend is brilliant. I hope you have a brilliant life. Much love.